I'm Linda Warner. I'm part of the ESD leadership team, and we're very happy to have you all here today and would like to welcome you. If you would like to rename yourself and put the city or state where you're coming from, that would be great. You can do that by hovering on the upper right corner of your screen. There are three dots that give you a menu, and you can hit rename and add where you're coming from. This program is presented by the Elders for Sound Democracy, which is a project of the Elders Action Network. We're a nonpartisan community of elders who are taking action to create a better world for future generations and all life. Our mission of ESD is to protect and strengthen democracy now and for future generations, and we won't back down. We're more concerned every day with the state of our democracy and what's happening. So that's what we're about. And today, I will say that the meeting is being recorded today. So next week, you'll receive a follow-up email that will have links to the presenter slides and to the recording. We ask that you not use the personal note taker today. I'd like to introduce Joff Baker. Joff is a part of the ESD leadership team and has taken the lead on our disinformation project. And he will take over and introduce our speaker for today.
Thanks, Linda. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce today's speaker, Alexandros Efstaratious, who is a computational scientist. He has a background in social and behavioral psychology, and he's a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Washington's Information School. Alex has a PhD from University College London, a Department of Computer Science. And he's, as I say, currently at the University of Washington Information School, really an expert on the subject of disinformation. So what he's going to do now is speak for 20 minutes, 23 minutes or so, and then I will shepherd questions from the audience, either raised hands, preferably if you're going to do that, just use the raised hand icon, or even more preferably, enter your questions into the chat and I will read them on. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Alex.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you everybody for making your time today to be here. I will just try and share my slides very quickly just to make sure this is working. And please let me know if you can't see them. Just give me 1 second. Okay, can everybody see the slides now?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, so the topic for today, I didn't want to specifically focus it on anything to do specifically with disinformation or polarization or any of these really specific topics that we tend to talk about, because really when we discuss the topic of disinformation, we're really talking about informational harms at large, and how these informational harms can actually lead people to occupy different kinds of social realities. And this is really going to be the topic for today. But of course, in getting there, I will be talking about a few other things that fall into these kinds of informational harms, things like disinformation, social polarization, algorithms, as well as new technologies that I'm sure everybody in this room is concerned about, like generative AI. And I will say that this won't be a clean segmentation between these topics because they're very intertwined. And so rather, we'll be exploring them under the same umbrella, and hopefully by the end, we'll understand each of these components just a little bit better. When in the past we talked about misinformation and disinformation, the definitions we tended to use were that misinformation is really anything that is false, and disinformation is any false information spread deliberately and knowingly, right? So the definition came down to intent. But in recent years, we've actually come to find that this definition is not particularly helpful in meeting the moment. specifically because it missed quite a lot of nuance and quite a lot of the ways in which these actors occupy the online space. Nowadays, when we talk about disinformation, we talk about really anything that causes chaos. And this is a specific quote by a former employee of Russia Today, who was quoted saying this in an interview by researchers at Oxford University. And so nowadays, we actually understand that disinformation is mostly participatory. Okay, actors will perform and they will respond to actions, and the audience of this disinformation, the receivers or the targets, if you like, they're not static sponges, right? They have informational demands that they need to be met, and so if an informational source doesn't meet those demands, audiences will shift to someone who will. Okay, and very typically, partisanship and one-sidedness of this information can form part of these demands. And for quite a while now, we've known this concept in the literature that is known as the price of bipartisanship. If somebody tries to kind of edge the line between political ideologies, political positions, they tend to pay a price in engagement. People just don't care much for that. And so you can think of it as being in the competition in the information space itself, right? And the summary from the slide that I want you to take away really is that influencers or actors, when it comes to disinformation, do not just decide what to put out there, right? They actually respond to audiences with informational demands. And if they don't meet those informational demands, they can risk losing those audiences. And another thing that is not static, other than the audiences, is of course time itself, right? So disinformation actors need to adapt. Back in, I would say 2016, and maybe a few years after that, the idea was centered around content production. Okay, and on your screens right now, you can actually see a quote by somebody who infiltrated one of these things that we call a troll farm, right? A really big state-sponsored organization that would hire people to just basically put things on social media to influence people or to manipulate people, right? And this person reported that part of her job was actually saying, just posting things about how Putin is doing such a great job on American social media. And this was reported by the Danish Institute for International Studies. But and this person infiltrated an organization known as the now defunct Russian Internet Research Agency, right? Which went defunct in 2023, but it was a massive player in shaping a lot of elections, both in the US, but also abroad in Britain and even other countries in the global South. So, and this content production actually ranged in sophistication, right? And we'll look at this more in a bit, but some of this content, we could actually detect it simply because it used broken English. So the sophistication was really variable there. But by 2024, the landscape actually changed quite substantially. And what we started seeing was foreign actors like Russia investing as much as 10 million US dollars to fund US-based content and news organizations. And a specific example that comes to mind here is Tenet Media. So a lot of American, commentators, political influencers worked for Tenet Media without ever knowing that their paychecks were actually coming from Russia, right? So what we call this is something called content laundering or news laundering, where these disinformation actors will occasionally try and use kind of homegrown ideas to really amplify the points of view that they want to put out there, because then they can just blast through that barrier of trust because people already trust a lot of these influencers. So they can just pick people that, would be beneficial to them at that given time, right? And then fund specific organizations to get their points across. And so there's the idea of content production, which still happens to a certain extent, but now we're also seeing a lot of more complicated space around laundering and amplification. And since we've touched on this idea of manufacturing and amplifying, there are actually multiple strategies that these malicious actors can use to sow divisions or to sow chaos, as we saw, right? And two really high-profile examples of outright division was, again, coming back to the Russian Internet Research Agency, an organization of simultaneous pro and anti-Islam protests in Houston, Texas, through an agency that through agency-run Facebook pages, right? And so these websites, these pages, Facebook pages that you're seeing on your screens right now, they were both run by the same people, okay? And you can see they're quite oppositional in nature. but that didn't prevent them from running them both and organizing physical counter protests at the same time in the same physical location, right? So here we're seeing an example of manipulation that seeped into the real world. And another example was when Iranian hackers actually used domains associated with the Proud Boys organization, a kind of known right-wing organization, to threaten democratic voters, right? So what these Iranian hackers did was they kind of usurped domains used by Proud Boys, and then they used those domains to threaten democratic voters along the line. So if you don't vote for Trump, we will come for you, right? So they were basically personifying Proud Boys to paint a bad picture around them. And this particular example is a case of what we call black propaganda. This is a case where the operations target is actually the one being personified, right? To make that a little bit easier to understand, let's say I'm a malicious actor that wants to foment a lot of Islamophobic sentiment, right? I could just make an account supposedly belonging to a Muslim person, right? And then just go on to make a bunch of anti-American posts. And of course, that will foment a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment among Americans, right? If you as an American see me as a Muslim posting, a lot of anti-American content, you might just come to hate me for that, right? And so this is what we generally refer to as black propaganda. Another example, as I kind of alluded to before, or a more covert way of doing this is just simply amplifying a lot of homegrown divisive content, okay? And this is an example of an Italian page run by an Italian citizen, right? This is called Radio Genoa on X. And this is kind of focused a lot on anti-immigrant and Islamophobic rhetoric. So the way in which malicious actors can manipulate this is the way algorithms work is that they rely on virality signals to determine what content to recommend to people, right? So if we see that lots of accounts are liking a post in really quick succession, right? So let's say as soon as the post is posted, 3,000 accounts immediately liked it, right? This will tell the algorithm that this post is very interesting to people. So a lot of these malicious actors occasionally will run what we call bot farms, right? They have these kind of robot accounts that look out for this content. And as soon as something's posted that kind of fits in with their narrative, they will immediately start liking that post in quick succession to boost it to the algorithm. And of course, that will show it to even more people, right? And this is an example of content that is actually, posted in, well, this is the user's true ideology, right? This account, again, belongs to an actual Italian citizen, but it's an example of a post that might be selected for amplification because it is divisive, it is agitating, and that means that people will engage with it, even if they don't agree with it. Okay, this is a very important distinction. You don't have to agree with something to engage with it. Platforms are not really trying to optimize for you liking things, but rather being there for as long as possible. And so if you're very angry and you spend a lot of time on a post, that actually tells the platform that you like the post. So this is all to say that there are a lot of actors, and we've actually seen a few, but we see malicious information operation agents. There are also domestic and ideological influencers and commentators, accounts that operate for monetary gain, so they post rage-bait content, etc. Audiences with other informational demands, but also elites, right? Political leaders with business influence, and also business people with outside influence. And so the information space, if I have to oversimplify it, and I know this doesn't look like a simple graphic, kind of looks like this, right? Elites might influence influencers influence audiences, but audiences actually respond to that content. So they send that signal back. And if the influencers are not doing a good enough job, they have to change their content. And at the same time, we have monetized actors that can actually borrow content from influencers and send that to audiences as well. And then malicious actors will look out for this content and try and determine what to amplify. It is a very complicated space. Okay, so this graphic is not meant to paint a complete picture, but rather to show you that it is not as simple as bad person, influencers, good person. Okay, it's much more complicated than that. And so in short, when we think about disinformation, we should actually instead think about information operations at large. When we think about persuasion, we should be thinking about destabilization in general. And when we're thinking about the dynamics, we should be thinking about participatory multi-actor dynamics, not just the top-down approach. And of course, in this entire space, a lot of organic things come into play. So baseline preferences of people. And of course, people can be organically polarized, right? They hold certain social identities. And they self-categorize in these kinds of identities based on their beliefs, maybe some kind of traits that they have. And in psychology, we call this the minimal group paradigm. The fact that we can actually split people into groups by just making or highlighting a specific aspect of their identity. And so in this particular case, I could split these people based on color of their skin. I could split them based on whether they wear glasses or not. And believe it or not, if I were to run a psychology experiment, that could give me a signal to actually divide people on. I could split them based on the color of their hat or their political ideology and so on, right? And of course, it really matters whether people care about these kinds of identities to begin with. But if I make them salient, I can create an informational environment around those salient identities. And this kind of creates a problem that some scholars have kind of referred to as the social media prism. The problem with social media is that the vast majority of online content is actually produced by very few people. And these few people that tend to produce the vast majority of the content, we're talking about 1% approximately, right? They tend to be way more extreme. And extremism gets much more attention online than other moderate discussions or moderate content. So the effective result of this is that things end up looking more polarizing than they are. But this is a problem because the looks of more polarization can actually drive more polarization, right? So if I keep seeing content of the other group hating me, then my natural response to that will be to hate them back, right? And Chris Bale wrote a fantastic book on this called The Social Media Prism. But this is roughly what that refers to, right? So the vast majority of content online being produced by very few people that also tend to be more extreme. And out of that content, the more extreme content will actually surface more through the algorithms because of these engagement dynamics. And just to touch on this idea of algorithms for a bit, right? Polarized networks and polarized exposure in general would actually be prevalent even in the absence of algorithmic recommendations, right? So this is all to say that left to their own devices, people will naturally divide into groups, okay? And this test, we've seen this time and time again. We've run some tests on other platforms like YouTube, but what algorithms will effectively do quite a lot is they will surface more agitating content, right? The more engaging content, because it naturally tends to be just more entertaining, right? If you're watching a drama on TV and nothing's happening, you're probably going to turn the TV on. And that's very true also of our informational space. And so people left to their own devices, right, will gravitate towards polarization, but algorithms are kind of exacerbating the problem in this way that they keep flashing this false polarization. And we can actually follow a few corrective approaches when it comes to harmful content or false content, right? But again, these all come with, you would say, terms and conditions. So let's talk about fact checking for a moment, right? Fact checking at large will work, right? If you present people with evidence, typically what we tend to find is that it tends to work. Like people do change their beliefs in the face of the information, but there is a problem with fact checking in partisan trust. Okay, so there is a very big disconnection there's partisan polarization actually in how much people do trust fact checkers as an institution, and so that creates a problem, right? And fact checking in recent years has actually fallen out of favor with platforms. And the other problem is how do you put fact checks in front of people that need them, right? That's probably arguably the biggest problem. But the trust problem has kind of been addressed using community fact checking. So now on X, we've seen this new feature called Community Notes, which is actually users looking at something that they know is false and actually posting a correction themselves, right? And of course, there's dynamics in the website to determine how trustworthy a user is. These community fact checks will only be shown to people if there's actually bipartisan agreement on them, right? But now we also see other platforms like Facebook and Instagram also kind of rolling this idea out. There's still problems with this approach, right? The very first problem comes when we actually look at the content popularity life cycle, right? So if you look at this graph right here at the bottom of your screen, typically when we post something, the vast majority of attention to that something will be diverted to it in the very first few hours of its posting, right? So the vast majority of people will engage with that content within the first few hours. Let's say that a fact check comes in at like day 2. By that point, the vast majority of people have already seen that content and they will never see it in their lives again. So they've seen it, the fact check comes in, very few people will see that tail end, right? So they will see the community note with the post, but the vast majority of people have seen it. Maybe they've believed it and they've moved on with their lives by that point. There's also other problems like audience bias. As I said, community fact checks rely on kind of bipartisanship signals, but sometimes, truth is not one-sided. Truth is one-sided, right? So sometimes one side is right, one side's wrong. So there's that problem. And also the problem of continued influence. When we encounter misinformation online, that narrative that it pushes continues to have an influence on us, even if, the actual piece of information itself is corrected. So it changes our perceptions. Again, if we see some kind of misinformation content about, somebody, for example, pushing Islamophobia by using kind of false information about a purported attack, right? That might still foment Islamophobia in me, even though I don't believe that that specific attack happened after I've read a fact check about it. That's the idea there. And the other problem is that problematic content is not always false, right? We have hate speech, we have agitation, manufactured outrage, sometimes even decontextualized information. So all of these things can continue to be problems. And there's another kind of elephant in the room, if you allow me to use that phrase, which is generative AI, right? And we've seen this really explode with the ongoing war in Iran, but we've seen a lot of AI-generated videos of, supposed attacks or supposed battles that turned out to just be completely false, right? And the problem with these AI-generated videos is, again, you could fact check them, but recent evidence suggests that even AI-generated videos actually have a continued influence. So the idea I just described, the idea that they continue to shape your beliefs even if they're corrected, also persists for generated videos. And that, of course, is a massive problem, right? And these are what I call the direct risks, things that I would imagine all of you in this room will be able to deduce just fine. But there are also indirect risks, right? So the problem with generated content is that what if we believe that everything's generated AI, right? So here on the screen, like these top two set of comments right here, they are taken from Twitter comments, right? X comments on a real video. But people in the comments are arguing that this is AI generated. And this was actually verified by BBC. It was a verified video that was actually taken on a phone camera. But of course, people didn't believe it because they thought it was AI. Maybe they found some kind of weird glare or something like that. But the indirect risk of generative AI content is that we no longer believe that anything is real. And of course, that that is a massive problem because trust becomes arbitrary, right? So the idea is that it is incredibly difficult now to actually occupy a shared reality. And our decision rule for whether we like something or not is, I'll trust it if I like it, or if it agrees with a social identity of mine. But if I don't like it, it's AI. I can just disregard it. And so that is a really real indirect risk. And if I want to kind of leave you with something today is that, disinformation, or rather, informational harms, as I like to refer to them, it is a system level problem. All right. And it requires system level solutions. And if you're thinking about solving the problem, you might want to adopt the system level thinking as well. So the idea here is that informational harms come in many shapes and forms and also at different levels. So we have the content generation level, and we might want to prevent people from generating bad content to begin with, right? Not just with AI, but by themselves as well. If we can't prevent that, we might want to prevent people from being exposed to this bad content, right? If we can't prevent exposure, we might want to prevent people from believing that that content is real, if it is indeed false, right? And if we can't prevent belief, then we might at least want to prevent attitude or behavior change because of that false content, okay? And so at the content generation level, platforms can actually step in here with their own content moderation, but also by changing monetary incentives, right? If we're paying people for putting really harmful content out there, they'll just continue to make it if they can make money, right? And so that can be amended through terms of service and policies. But legislators as well can amend that using other speech laws, but also implementing some accountability mechanisms, both for people producing this kind of content, but also platforms that feature it, right? At the level of exposure, again, platforms can step in using recommendation systems and changing those to, surface more positive content. And again, implementing content moderation. Users themselves can curate their own content. They can limit their screen time. And recently, there have been a few initiatives where new platforms are actually allowing researchers and developers in general to actually create their own algorithms. And there's a little bit of promise in that space, but it is very early on. So hopefully, I'll have a report for you in a couple of years on that. In terms of belief, again, platforms can feature different kind of fact-checking partnerships or fact-checking features. So the community notes idea that we've seen. Users can look out for verified sources, right? And they can also vet who they follow online. And maybe you want to only follow people that actually are known to issue corrections when they get something wrong, as opposed to just shoving it under the rug or just generally being very kind of clickbaity. And communities in this case can actually implement quite a lot of digital literacy initiatives, right? How do you spot generative AI content? How do you know something's false? How do you stop and think, right? And there's a lot of methodologies like the SIFT methodology out there that kind of train people on how to just kind of stop, check, and then continue your scrolling. And in terms of the behavior change aspect, right? Platforms can look at how they can balance perspectives, create more kind of unified networks. At the community level, again, this really just comes down to being exposed to diverse people. So my signals come from people that I know rather than from what some stranger online tells me, right? And for the user level, just real grounding in reality. We call this touching grass, but sometimes just thinking, if I am online, right, and everything's on fire, but then I step out and take a walk in the park, why is everything not on fire there? Well, it all comes down to, again, what gets surfaced online, right? It needs to be engaging. It needs to be to grab your attention. So the informational space online is very different than the offline world. So I will stop there. I did take a couple more seconds, so I apologize for that. But thank you. That is my email if anybody wants to ask any follow-up questions. But I'm also looking forward to your questions now. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex. So time for questions. I'll start out by looking at the chat. Couple of comments. One is, can you give an example where using a system level process, maybe at content level, has impacted a major disinformation effort?
That is a great question. And one thing to preface here is that typically disinformation efforts are discovered after the fact. At least that used to be the case. So specific disinformation efforts, the idea with system level interventions would be that you're trying to prevent these actors from, or at least enabling them from doing it to begin with, right? Part of these examples have been, for example, on Reddit, it's kind of a pretty big platform in the US. There was quite a consistent narrative around there with some really, really polarized communities that were specifically focused on just spreading hate, right? So they were focused on fatphobic hate, again, Islamophobic hate. All these communities kind of got banned around 2020. So they just outright threw those forms out of the platform and said, if you want to, have these kind of talking points, go to your own websites. And that's what they did. And what ended up happening there, that's kind of like a two-sided approach again. A lot of people did migrate to these new platforms. They were much less moderated and they became much more extreme, but their size shrunk. So, and what researchers found after the fact was that the reason they got more extreme was because it was the most extreme users that left those platforms to begin with. So impacting disinformation efforts, sometimes we have kind of ongoing monitoring. It's hard to sometimes verify whether something is a disinformation or information operation effort before it finishes. But again, for example, shadow banning is another approach you can take. If you see that a specific account is pushing a lot of consistent talking points, it's looking suspicious, right? Their content is getting a lot of engagement from bots, known bots. You can turn the knob down on that. And that's sometimes something that platforms do is they shadow ban. So they reduce the engagement without outright banning them. And so that reduces exposure to people. Hopefully that answered the question.
Great, thank you. Well, I'll ask one. So here's sort of a Pollyanna thought that you will probably shoot down. My Pollyanna thought is that maybe, what we really want is we want a trusted, broadly trusted information source. Like the New York Times used to be way back when. And the question is there a way of getting to a broadly believed, broadly trusted information source? And so my notion was that perhaps that source will be artificial intelligence. That, artificial intelligence we use more and more to solve routine problems. How to fix my tractor, why I have a pain in my right side, all of that sort of stuff. And it just becomes just an automatic relationship one has. And every time it helps you, my notion is that you believe it more and more. And I'm wondering whether or not that can have a large catchment area, that kind of trust. So please shoot that down, but that's my happy thought.
Um, it is a great point, and I do agree that, again, LLMs, these chatbots that we have right now, they do get a lot of things right. They're trained on massive amounts of data, so you can think of them as a repository of just almost all of the world's information online, right? So they scrape a lot of this data. They're trained on a lot of different sources. So they're trained on social media comments. They're also trained on Wikipedia articles and news articles. Um, so they do get a lot of things right because, you can scrape the surface with them. Um, and I would say, maybe they'll get 80% of the things right. And then if you get into really expert territory, that's where you start to see that they're starting to get a few things wrong. So, you can use them as kind of an initial sort of sounding board, but again, there are potential problems with generated by AI in the sense that, first of all, they're only really trained on information already out there, right? So they can't really come up with new things on their own. It's whatever they've learned, it's in their training sets. So it has to be things that somebody's fed them. And they're continuously being corrected by human feedback. So the way these models are being trained is that you have a bunch of humans that correct them when they get something wrong. So there is a human element to that always, and you do need moderators of that model itself. When we talk about AI, right, it really depends on who's making the AI, right? There's different platforms, different models, different companies that run them, and so they behave in different ways. They're good for different things. So I think you're right in the sense that maybe we'll end up in a situation where we're like, so far we've been like, I trust Fox or I trust the New York Times. Maybe in the future we'll say I trust OpenAI or I trust Anthropic. It remains to
Right,
be seen, but yeah.
right. Thank you. So another question is, how does the concept of malignant narcissism play into your research and conclusions?
That is a very great question as well, and also a difficult one. And thank you, Dick, for asking that. Also, thank you for bringing me here. So it's a pretty big concept. It's not necessarily my specific area of research, and so I don't want to say anything that's kind of out of line here or false. But as far as I'm aware, this is mostly studied with regards to the influencer persona, right? So typically there's kind of self-selection there. A lot of the people that might think they'll make it as influencers tend to be higher in certain traits. And in the information space, again, we do know that narcissism is associated with things like being less receptive to correction or being less receptive, a tendency to double down, to put it more bluntly. So I haven't really worked into the psychopathology of influencers or people that generate content online, but I would assume there's a kind of big element of psychological traits on who might end up actually producing this content online, and of course the way in which they produce this kind of content. But yeah, we mostly look at this from a network perspective, and so that's all I can really say on that.
Great. Another one is, how does Wikipedia fit into all of this?
I really love Wikipedia. And the reason I love Wikipedia is that it is an open source project, which means that everybody can contribute to it. And then there are kind of community mechanisms that determine whether something should make it to the final page or not. And sometimes when you're reading through an article, you'll see a claim and then a question mark with citation needed here. And that's users correcting other users, right? So you've made a claim here, but who said that? Come back and verify this. And so this community perspective is it's kind of a window into a world of people arguing in good faith. So that the effective result is Wikipedia, right? You can think of it that way. And so I think that there is still a lot of space for Wikipedia to occupy. First of all, a lot of this generative AI content is trained on Wikipedia articles. And so it is a repository of a lot of knowledge out there in the world. And it's gotten a lot better, right? When I was in school, people told me don't use Wikipedia because my teachers, right? Because it's not trustworthy. But 10 years later, this has changed. Wikipedia is actually surprisingly accurate on a lot of things. So I still think that there is a role for crowdsourced initiatives like Wikipedia, and I don't think it can be replaced because, again, when we get rid of Wikipedia, we get rid of a large chunk of training data for the models that we use to ask, these AI models that we ask, how do I fix my tractor, as just said. So
Great. And yet another one, how soon does fact check need to happen after the disinformation hits social media to make a difference?
yeah, I mean, ideally the second it hits it, but that's very, very unlikely. Again, here, if there's a massive delay I mean, the longer it takes, the less effective it is because by that time, the vast majority of people have already seen it. So, to make a difference, I mean, it does make a difference already, right? We do know that community nodes specifically, for example, have kind of a causal influence on how many people see it and how many people like a post after a community node hits. I can't remember the exact figure right now. I think it's approximately about 20% of the influence that would come after the fact, right? But of course, that means that since it's percentage based, right? The sooner we slap it on there, and the more of that curve I showed we can capture, the better. So yeah.
Great. And let's see, yet another one from Ken Barnes. As you said, AI can't be relied on as a source we can all trust, i.e., such as becoming the new New York Times. Do you think there's any way most people, paren, or a significant swath of the population can trust some particular source or group of sources, maybe some honest brokers, each of several spaces along the spectrum? And if so, what can we do to hasten this result?
Yeah, this is another really good question. So I do want to preface this by saying I wouldn't say it can't be relied on as a source. It does get quite a lot of things right, but again, when you get to that kind of bottom end of that tail, when you get to the really expert territory, that's when it starts making mistakes. So um, I can just tell you how I personally use AI, which is I use it as a sounding board, maybe, get some original ideas out of it and then check whatever the AI is telling me with verified sources. So if I am, and this is a kind of a messy process. So if I'm looking for, I don't know, a specific, let's say I'm in the market for a new computer, right? One thing you could do is you could just ask it for base models or some really good brands, and then you can go on and look at those brands in an actual retailer and actually look at the ratings that other users give those products, right? Rather than trusting the AI to give you a 5-star a rating out of 5 for different products. So that's one way you can use it. And the group of honest brokers point is an interesting one because how honest people are is really subjective, and especially now in this current informational space, it's incredibly messy. And trust tends to be people that agree with me. This is where we're at right now because we're incredibly polarized. So um, I think diversification is like treat it as an investment. Diversification is probably the best strategy here. Just try and see what people are saying across the board. And again, AI can be useful for that. It can be part of that entire approach. It can be one of your sources, but maybe not the go-to, right? It can be maybe an initial point, or you can use whatever it says and then fact check it as well. So by just looking up how accurate it is. So it's not a particularly clean answer, but hopefully that gives you kind of a starting point there.
Well, if there are no other questions, I will then ask the last one. And I guess, I'd be interested in sort of a crystal ball prediction from you. I got to say, listening to all of this, the rapidly increasingly sophisticated world of informational harms um, would make it seem to me that democracy doesn't have much of a fighting chance going forward. What is your take on that question?
This is the point at which it really depends on what the major players are doing. And again, right now we are in a very weird space, and so it does look like things are very pessimistic right now. Um, and that's, it's because not enough of the focus is on these harms right now. We kind of saw that about 4 years back, there was a lot more discussions around this, a lot more funding for this kind of work that is not really available at the moment. But these things are constantly changing. They're dynamic. They're not static. So right now, yes, it does look like that way. But if again we kind of go back to the idea of generative AI content, it's a very new frontier, and so whether that ends up being a good or bad technology really comes down to how regulators respond and how platforms respond in response to regulators and how users respond to that, right? So there are some new initiatives. I know the European Union specifically is quite interested right now in this idea of provenance. So the idea that when something is AI generated, there's a marker there that just indicates that. So the moment anything hits any platform, it gets slapped with this label that this is AI generated, right? It's not implemented yet, and there's no technology at the moment. Well, there is a technology to do it, but it hasn't been implemented by platforms, right? But there are responses like that, and so how this ends up playing out, I think remains to be seen.
Great, thanks. Actually, and I lied. There is one more question we have for you. Of 1 minute for one more question, and that is, do you have an opinion about the wisdom of intentionally looking at postings from the opposite end of polarity?
Um, it really depends on what kinds of things you're looking at, right? It's really easy to engage in really bad faith arguments, and then we call that straw manning, right? So engage with a really kind of thinned down version of somebody else's argument, and then just kind of, eject it based on the idea that it's just really weak. That will tend to happen when you are scrolling through social media because, again, that content is not meant to be nuanced, it's meant to be engaging. I mean, to actually get to the bottom of why people hold specific positions, you need to understand what kind of information they believe, what are the facts that they know, right? Even if they might be false, and then kind of start working from there. It's incredibly hard to do without like a deep conversation with somebody about their beliefs. And so, social media is probably not the best place to do that. But I have seen a few new kind of channels and a new kind of influencer now that is kind of, I see that on Instagram quite a lot, actually, that are kind of trying to bridge the two sides politically. So they're saying things like, post in the comments why you think, if you're a Democrat, why do Republicans, what's a good trait about Republicans and vice versa. So, there's some kind of community-driven initiatives on that front as well, but I would say just talk to people
Talk to
would be
people.
my,
Okay.
yeah.
Alex, I want to thank you so much, both for your presentation and taking all of these questions. Alex has been nice enough to agree to hang around to the end to say a few final words. But Alex, final thoughts?
Yeah, I'll first of all touch on what Clint said about, the fear aspect. I just want to say that I did want to paint a complete picture so we kind of all understand what we're dealing with, but this is a pretty common response, and a lot of people are working on this. A lot of really great people are working on this, and I think this group is an example of that. And so I just want to probably leave you with this idea that, again, I talked about this idea of a system at the end, and it's a really well-oiled machine. And I feel like if each of us, I'm in the academic research side of things, if each of us kind of does their part in that entire system, then the system will become better. And so you don't have to solve all of it, right? But just the parts that you can actually address. So just a little bit of optimism there. It's not an impossible thing to improve. It's maybe impossible to fix, but not impossible to improve. And really, that's what we're trying to do here. Um, And I don't know. I guess I can briefly touch on Geoff's question on legal repercussions for lying, which I would. It's an incredibly slippery slope, and I think a lot of people are rightly very well, not very amenable, I guess, to outright speech laws governing the way in which. But, sometimes you want to lie because it's funny. That's something that tends to come up a lot. It's just funny to lie. So. There are a few, I mean, there are legal frameworks around things like libel. You can't really lie with intent to harm somebody when that that's a false claim you're making about them. But certainly, I think there could be more done around the idea of people that are outright lying to make money out of it. There's a consistent pattern. There's a very quantitative difference between somebody that got something wrong and somebody who just doesn't care how much harm they're causing because they're going to get a paycheck at the end of the month. And so maybe that is legal space there.
Great. Thank you. Thank you
John,
very much.
could I just follow up? I know Alex is about ready to leave, but do you have any thoughts about a role or roles for elders, those of us who are tech immigrants?
Yes. So I would say that, yeah, the first thing is, just meetings like this, I think, are really fantastic. It's a really great way of, again, kind of grappling with the reality of the situation. So I think a lot of you in this room are already doing a lot of the things that you probably should be doing, and we're also learning a lot from older generations and how to deal and how to actually create these affordances and new technologies. So there always needs to be this kind of back and forth. I feel like many of you might be on the front lines in your communities as well. And again, Clint, you kind of mentioned this idea of just talk to people offline. I think with these initiatives, you can also occupy that kind of online space, right? Now a lot of the younger generations are being raised in this new, really fast-paced environment. They haven't really grown the skills to understand nuance. It's mostly, this thing today, the other thing tomorrow, because it's being like everybody's competing for their attention constantly. And so even educating people on picking up the nuance, right? That's a really great role that generations that grew up in a much more sort of hands-on setting can actually, do. So even developing educational initiatives around how you pick something apart, even if in the offline area, that would be massively helpful for as a resource. So
Alex.
I feel like the legislative space and the regulatory space, what it can do is actually change the dynamics of platforms themselves and what they incentivize, which is the economic aspect. Again, this is a very lucrative business for some people, right? They make a lot of money just putting out content constantly. And that's not very well thought out, dare I say. And so changing the dynamics of what kind of content might be allowed on the platforms might also force the platforms to reconsider what they're monetizing and what they're actually boosting. If I say that now, if I'm constantly flagging you as being fact checked, and this happens to a certain extent, your content will start to get shadow banned, so nobody will be seeing it anymore. Now, all of a sudden, as a creator, I have a new incentive to be careful, right? But of course, it's not enough. Like I'm talking about platforms adopting more initiatives that might start at the regulatory space. That's kind of what my point was there. In terms of the social ostracizing part, yeah, a lot of people are doing that already. We had a chat about that in our breakout room for a bit about how the people that were the initial agitators are slowly becoming kind of the new establishment and losing trust because of that. They're bleeding their trust that they established at the beginning. So that certainly happens, but again, it takes time. And in the social aspect of it, not everybody's going to agree. You need to pick your audience, and these audiences right now are very polarized. And so you just pick a camp and stick with it. Which complicates matters a little bit in this particular year.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks.
So thanks so much for joining us and for everything you've communicated to us today. And I know you have to go, but again, thanks one more time. Actually, Linda was going to say a few words about what's going on in ESD very briefly. Linda?
Yes, and thank you, Alex. I know we could go on and on asking more questions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what ESD is doing right now and plans to do as soon as my slides will move. they're not. There we go. Well, as you might guess, this next year, from now until November, our focus is voting. And where our goals are to increase voter access and have a massive turnout because we know that's what's needed in November. And it's at a time when we're also at the same time battling a lot of moves for voter suppression. And we want to concentrate on providing voter information, protection, and mobilization. And so that will be the focus of each of our teams that are gearing up right now. And we've got a new voting action team that's doing the planning and coordination. Our Defend Democracy will do action alerts. And we have right now 4 state chapters that are doing their own thing in terms of getting out the vote in their states. Arizona is our newest state, and we invite you to join any of these state chapters or start a new one in your state. And for communications, I will say that we're looking for help in writing and editing newsletters and our promotions. And Sue, can you advance the next slide? I'm not sure why they're not moving.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't have any control of your slides.
Okay. Well, I don't seem to either.
Well, Linda, we're actually running relatively
Okay.
short on time. Maybe you could just verbally summarize what else there was, and then I know you're going to
Yes.
bring the whole session home. So
Yeah, I'll do that. We'll be sending out a follow-up email today that has our upcoming events linked to it, so you can register for those. Next week, we'll be sending out a link to the recording and to the slides, which I know I'm really looking forward to looking at Alex's slides and listening again. After our community meetings the following week, we have a conversation for democracy. And the intent there is to invite new people, particularly to come in and talk with several people from the leadership team to find out what we're doing, to share ideas and to learn from each other and how we might get involved. And so that's on April 22nd, a week from today. And we've got action team meetings that are coming up. Ken's Defend Democracy team meets on Monday, and our voting action team meets on April 28th, where a lot's going to come together there. And our next meeting is in May. The theme is Don't Despair, Prepare. And we know how we're all feeling right now and how overwhelming everything can seem. And we're still in the works planning this meeting, but we do understand that we need to be aware of what's happening and to prepare for whatever might happen in the next 6 months. So that information will all be coming to you, and I probably not, yeah. I don't think we have time to show the disinformation. You want to do that, Joff?
no, I think we should just stay
Okay.
on time.
Okay. All right. Okay. So anyway, there's lots of opportunities coming up to get involved for this election coming up, and you'll see that information coming out next week.